I'm always happy to be here to be part of FPCI events. I think Dino's vision of creating this institution to help young Indonesians and all Indonesians better understand foreign policy and all of the things that are happening in the world, and most importantly, Indonesia's role in the world, and it's increasingly an important role. I think is so important. So again, a warm congratulations to Dino, and I'm so pleased to see how FPCI has grown over the years. And I gather this year your foreign policy conference in October will attract what, 10,000 people or more, which is an amazing statistic. Both an achievement for FPCI, but also a sign of the great interest that all of you and so many others take in Indonesia's role in the world. So congratulations. I'm also here wearing my hat as the co-chair of the US-Indonesia Society, popularly known as USINDO. After I left Indonesia, I was asked to join the board. And then at my first board meeting, they said, congratulations, you're the co-chair of the board. Which I was glad to do, because USINDO is devoted to strengthening principally people-to-people ties between the United States and Indonesia. And we've got a lot of new efforts underway to do that, to get more Americans here to Indonesia to help understand the important things that are happening in this country and the important future that this country has, but also to help get more Indonesians to the United States in various capacities, as exchange students, as interns, or whatever we can do. So I'm very glad to be a part of that. I have some prepared remarks, so I'll kind of go through those, and then I'll be happy to take your questions on really any subject that you'd like to talk about. So you have license to hunt, so whatever you'd like to talk about. But as Dino said, when I travel around the world, as I do now more frequently to other countries, I'm frequently asked sort of what on earth is going on in Washington, D.C., as Dino said. And I think the publication of Bob Woodward's new book, which I see Rosa has, it's called Fear, has sort of popularized the term crazy town for describing what's going on in Washington right now. And so I thought I would sort of use my remarks today to talk a little bit about some of the trends in Washington, D.C. And of course, there's all kinds of speculation now. Is President Trump going to be impeached? There are just daily controversies that the president himself creates sometimes, but that spark all kinds of intense debate in Washington, D.C. these days. There's a lot of workers, or give the United States a disproportionate share, in his view, of the costs of maintaining those multilateral organizations. So that's why, for example, he decided to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's why he decided to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, and at times has called into question the value even of such bedrock alliances as NATO for the United States. President Trump has proposed substantially reducing U.S. contributions to the United Nations, and he's already announced that the United States will withdraw from UNESCO, as well as from the UN Human Rights Council. He has confronted China over many of its unfair trade practices and its theft of intellectual property from American companies. And that, by the way, is an area where I think he enjoys fairly bipartisan support. The challenge sometimes is in the tactics that he's employing to challenge that. On the domestic side, President Trump is really focused like a laser on fulfilling his campaign promises of bringing back jobs to the assembly line. That is, bringing back blue-collar jobs. And he's tried to do that principally through deregulation and by cutting taxes on business, again, to help restore the business sector in the United States and hopefully create more jobs. So to advance those goals, Trump is seeking to renegotiate the North American Free Trade Agreement. He's imposed a very wide series of tariff measures on China that by this week are expected to be duties on a total of about $250 billion of Chinese goods. And he's imposed additional duties on key imports such as steel, 25% tariff on steel, aluminum, 10%, with most of our key allies, including most of our European allies. I see the EU ambassador here, my good friend Vincent. That has been obviously very, very controversial in the EU, but also in the United States. The president has proposed substantial changes to our immigration system, vowing to construct a border wall along our border with Mexico, removing all unlawful entrants into the United States, including many of the agricultural workers and others who really perform a very valuable service in the United States that most Americans, work that most Americans don't want to do. And he's vowed to end what he calls chain migration, that is, family members who are already in the United States applying for other family members to join them as American citizens. And also he's proposed to eliminate the visa lottery system, the system by which many Indonesians, in fact, have benefited and have gone to the United States and gotten immigrant visas. One thing I think that's important for you all to know is that many of these policies have been challenged by the U.S. Congress, by the U.S. court system, by the judicial system, and by our very strong non-governmental organization, our NGOs. So the border wall, for example, even though that's been one of President Trump's top priorities, Congress thus far has refused to fund it because they just don't think that it's going to do that much good, and it's a very, very expensive proposition. Nor has the administration thus far received congressional approval to stop the visa lottery program. Because in fact we do want to try to diversify our immigration system. And again, it enjoys fairly wide support among the business community, but also in Congress. But in many ways, Trump has turned traditional Republican policies on their head. For example, the Republican Party used to be the party that argued against high budget deficits. And now the situation has been reversed. It's the Democrats, for the most part, who are the budget deficit hawks, as they call it, the people who are trying to oppose high budget deficits. And it's the Trump administration that's actually passed policies that have increased the budget deficit quite substantially. Most notably, the most recent budget deal that provided for a big tax cut for the U.S. business sector. As a result of that most recent budget deal, annual budget deficits are expected to exceed $1 billion and are going to continue to rise. So I think that's going to be an issue in the upcoming elections. So those are just a few of the key policies that I think all of you should be aware of. And now let me just talk a little bit about what has been the economic and political impact inside the United States of those in terms of the American voters. So let me take those each in turn. Let me talk first about the economic impact. From the president's perspective, the economic impact of the policies that he has undertaken thus far has been very positive. Let me just cite a few statistics. Our GDP growth, the broadest measure of economic growth, remains very, very strong. Second quarter growth in the United States for 2018 was just under 4%, which is very, very high for a major economy. Secondly, unemployment remains very, very low. It's just under 4%. And the economy continues to generate a very healthy 150,000 to 200,000 jobs a month. So the jobs picture is also very, very positive. Third, the financial markets remain very, very bullish about Trump administration policies thus far. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, which is the most common measure of the markets, was up 31% in Trump's first year in office, and it's up again this year, not quite as high, but still quite strong growth and well above GDP growth. To be fair, the news is not all good. many analysts have pointed out that foreign direct investment into the United States has fallen substantially since Trump took office. According to the Congressional Budget Office, which is an independent office that works for Congress, in the first quarter of 2016, total of 2016, so that was 2 years ago, total net FDI inflow was 146.5 billion, so about 150 billion. For the same quarter in 2017, it went down to 90 billion. And in 2018, so far, it's down to 51 billion. So roughly a third of what it was 2 years ago. So a lot of foreign companies have some concerns about uncertainty in the United States and have lowered their investment in the United States. Now, this is especially worrying because Congress and the administration took several steps that should have helped to boost FDI during that period. In particular, the business tax cut that was passed that I already talked about should have lowered taxes quite substantially for foreign investors and made, therefore, their production and their investment much more profitable. So it did, in fact, do that. But so, again, the fact that the tax cut didn't have much of an impact and FDI continued to go down is, I think, quite telling. I think on the trade side, many are very concerned that the administration's tariffs are having a harmful impact on the U.S. economy. Probably the most influential business group in the United States is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And the influential president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, a guy called Tom Donahue, who's a Republican, recently stated that tariffs are beginning to take a toll on American businesses, workers, farmers, and consumers as overseas markets close to American-made products and prices increase here at home. And continuing his quote, tariffs are simply taxes that raise prices for everyone in the United States, and tariffs that beget more tariffs only lead to a trade war that will cost American jobs and economic growth. So that, again, that's from the principal business group in the United States, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Critics have also questioned the Trump administration's tactics on trade. As I said earlier, many people support the Trump administration confronting China, for example, on some of its unfair trade practices. But they have questioned the tactics that he's used to go about that. Former Treasury Secretary and former Harvard President Larry Summers, who's a very distinguished economist, pointed out recently that a key rule of strategy in general is to try to unite your friends and divide your adversaries. And certainly everyone wants to see China pursue more fair trade policies and to stop stealing intellectual property. But if the U.S. truly wants to make headway, Summers argued, it should be enlisting its Asian allies and the EU who share our concerns so that we speak with a common voice. Instead, as Larry Summers argues, the United States seems to be doing the opposite. We have alienated our Asian partners by pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the United States upset its group of 7 allies by imposing tariffs on steel and aluminum, as well as by making further threats that caused them to doubt the U.S. commitment to rule of law in the global trading regime. So that was Larry Summers' assessment of the tactics, and I think a lot of people agree with that assessment. Likewise, I think many experts in the United States argue that by pulling out of multilateral agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the president disadvantaged American companies because we no longer had a role, therefore, in helping to set the rules in, let's say, the TPP. And we didn't do anything to replace the TPP. If you're going to withdraw from TPP, then logically it would follow that you would try to negotiate bilateral free trade agreements. But so far that hasn't happened. So effectively we've sort of unilaterally withdrawn, but not really done anything to replace that. And I think many people have been concerned about that. Now, let me get to the very important political impact of some of President Trump's policies in the United States. First, let me start by saying that President Trump's approval ratings have been the lowest of any post-World War II elected president in their first 2 years. So right now they're about 36%, according to the latest CNN poll. And those are lower than for those of, for example, President Clinton or President Obama, both of whom suffered fairly catastrophic losses in their first midterm elections after they were elected. But what I want you to, all of you to understand, and I think, again, most foreigners don't understand this, is that despite all of that, despite those low approval ratings by the average American, Trump's support among his base, that is the people that really turned out to vote for him and put him into office in the last elections, remains very strong. Now, why is that? The Wall Street Journal reported a very telling survey a few months ago in which 65% of those who responded to this poll said that, quote, agreed with the statement that the system in America is rigged every day against ordinary Americans. So let me just say that again. 65% of Americans agreed with that statement, that the American system is rigged against ordinary Americans. That is one of the key principles that President Trump ran on. And his whole idea of sort of disrupting the entire system was built on that idea that the whole system is rigged against ordinary Americans. So 3/4 of Democrats, as well as 6 in 10 Republicans, agreed with that assessment. And Trump has very effectively tapped into that concern. So his supporters, who are out there in the heartland of America, they tend to ignore the daily tick-tock of controversies in Washington. They don't read the Washington Post or the New York Times like many of us do, because they believe that only President Trump is really the only guy who's working in Washington to help with their concerns and try to address their concerns. And they think that everybody else in Washington is out of touch. And that's why you see the president going out almost every 2 weeks to do these campaign-style rallies all over the country so that he can continue to remind people that he's their guy. He's the guy who's working against Washington to try to solve their concerns. I think another factor that's very, very important for you all to understand is that Trump has a very good sense of what his base cares about and what they will vote for to ensure that his policies and his public statements will reflect and have the approval of his base. So when he looks at things like opinion polls, things like that, he doesn't really care. What he cares about is 2 things. He cares about what his base thinks, and he cares about the markets. He follows the stock market very closely as a very important barometer of how he's doing. As long as the stock market's doing pretty well, he judges that he's doing pretty well. So again, the president enjoys still very strong support among his base. And so why does that matter? That matters because most Republicans who serve in Congress have been very reluctant to criticize Trump. And why is that? Because they're all up for re-election in November. All of the House of Representatives and 1/3 of the Senate are up for re-election every single year, every 2 years in Washington. And they fear the support that President Trump has among his base and among Republicans in their districts. So they know that if they criticize him or if they vote against him, that he's going to go after them in their districts, and they don't want to see that. So they've largely given him a pass in Congress. They really haven't exercised their oversight responsibilities. And again, that might be something that's going to change. I think President Trump has also had really quite surprising success in sowing doubt about things that are said against him. So, for example, as many of you know, he will often just outright deny things that are said about him, even when the facts suggest otherwise. He often makes, quite misleading statements to try to blur the facts as much as possible and make it kind of confusing to people. And that's, I think, a conscious tactic and frankly, a successful tactic. Many of you have seen that the Washington Post keeps a running tally of all the misleading statements that the president makes. I think that's now up to something like 4,700 since the beginning of the administration. And it's a very factual-based thing. And again, they have a very comprehensive list of them. The other thing is President Trump, when somebody criticizes him, I'm sure you've all noticed, he hits right back, right away. And that tends to make people a little bit more afraid of confronting him to begin with. And most importantly of all, he constantly dismisses critical articles in reputable newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post as what he calls fake news. And I think that has had a real impact in creating antagonism against the press. And that's one of the areas where I do worry that the impact of President Trump may be a little bit longer than whatever his tenure in office is. So why does all this matter? And what does this all mean for the midterm elections in the United States? One of America's most astute election observers is a guy called Charlie Cook. And Charlie Cook puts out something called the Cook Report, which is widely read by election gurus and people that really follow elections closely. And he remarked that midterm elections traditionally in the United States are referendums, votes on the president, and that will be particularly true in this November elections, because there's so much interest and so much controversy surrounding the Trump administration. As I said, all 435 members of the House of Representatives will be up for re-election in November, as will 1/3 of the Senate. So what are some of the things that we can expect to influence voter behavior? First of all, traditionally, people who are angry tend to be more motivated to vote in midterm elections than those who are happy. And in this case, Democrats are angry. Democrats are very angry. And so you've seen a couple of elections thus far that have taken place, and you've seen very, very high turnout of Democratic electors. And that's a good bet that will happen again in these midterm elections. A recent New York Times analysis pointed out that white voters without a college degree, who form a big part of President Trump's base, typically turn out in smaller numbers in midterm elections. So that's not very good news for Republicans in general or for President Trump. Whereas turnout among college-educated voters, who tend to vote Democratic, has been unusually high in special and general elections since Mr. Trump took office. So again, another indicator that probably the Democrats are going to do pretty well. So if these patterns hold, the combination of a better educated battleground and lower turnout among less educated voters means that most experts are predicting that the Democrats are going to retake control of the House of Representatives in these next elections. And let me just, one more fact for all of you to remember. Americans in general are uncomfortable with having one party hold all of the levers of power in government, which the Republicans now do, because they have the presidency, they have the House of Representatives, they have the Senate, and they have, of course, the court system as well. A new Quinnipiac University poll from late last week, which is quite an influential polling system, said that voters want Congress to be more of a check on President Trump by 58% to 27%. So that's just across the board, Democrats and Republicans. So again, another indicator that there's fairly strong support see the Democrats take back at least the House, if not possibly the Senate as well. Of course, we're still 2 months away. A lot can change in 2 months, but that's kind of a snapshot of where we are thus far. I should say most analysts still believe that the Republicans are likely to hold on to the Senate. But even there, if there's a real wave of Democratic support, the Democrats possibly could take the Senate, but that seems much more unlikely at this point. So, you're probably now asking, well, why does Ambassador Blake spend so much time on this, and why does it matter if the Democrats take back the House or the Senate or whatever? I'll explain that to you. As I said earlier, right now the Republicans control both the House and the Senate. And because of Trump's popularity in the base, they have been reluctant to exercise their oversight functions. So there have been virtually no congressional hearings or investigations into any aspect of what I've just talked about over the last 2 years. Certainly individual Republican senators like Senator McCain and a few others who are mostly retiring have raised some questions. But there really hasn't been much of a peep out of Congress on anything because of, again, the Republicans control both the House and the Senate. If the Democrats take back either the House or the Senate, that would completely change. You should, let's just say they take back the House of Representatives, you should expect them to announce a whole series of hearings and investigations into all the controversial aspects of Trump's foreign and domestic policy, as well as what they see as many ethical lapses by President Trump and his family. So this would dramatically escalate pressures against the president personally, but against the administration more broadly. All right, let me just briefly talk about the implications of all this for Indonesia and U.S. relations, and then I'll be glad to take your questions. So, despite the convulsions that have marked foreign policy in the first 2 years of the Trump administration, I think U.S.-Indonesia relations have survived largely unscathed thus far, compared to the really dramatic changes that we've seen in our foreign policy with respect to the European Union, with respect to China, with respect to many of our other principal foreign policy partners. When I was ambassador here in Jakarta, I used to lament that Indonesia really didn't get that much attention in Washington. I now think, and you know, I used to say that there's genuine bipartisan support in Washington for what's happening in Indonesia, and I still think that's true. People admire Indonesia's democracy. They admire the fact that you're a G20 country with $1 trillion economy. They admire the strong counterterrorism record that your country has. And I think they admire the fact that you as a country on the whole are a country where your best days still lie ahead. You have a young country, and you're going to be an increasingly important country in the years to come. Now, several factors, in my view, have helped to buffer, have helped to protect Indonesia from some of the things that are happening in Washington. First, the administration early on prioritized Indonesia as one of the countries that they wanted to pay special attention to. So we had very helpful high-level visits by two very influential people in the administration. First, the Vice President Pence, and secondly, Defense Secretary James Mattis. And so both of them came very early on in the administration to Indonesia, got to know about the country, and I think have been important advocates for you and for our relations behind the scenes since then. Second, the fact that U.S.-Indonesia trade and investment totals are still relatively modest, believe it or not, is an advantage, because it's helped to keep Indonesia a little bit below the radar on a lot of these target lists that the administration has put out. Ironically, in many ways, that's been an advantage for you. Third, I think your leaders have engaged effectively
with the Trump administration. So the most recent example of that was the visit by your trade minister, Engar Lukita, who was there in July. And he met with some of the key trade officials, with Secretary Ross, Secretary of Commerce Ross, with the U.S. Trade Representative. And, you know, he very forthrightly looked at, you know, what Indonesia could do to try to improve the trade deficit. And so he did a smart thing, and he offered to help reduce the trade deficit by increasing, particularly allowing America to increase agricultural exports. For example, soybean exports, cotton exports, wheat exports, all of which are really important, and particularly important now because a lot of those farmers are seeing their markets in China dry up because of the trade war with China. So having the opportunity to export more to a place like Indonesia is a hugely important opportunity for them, and I think, again, a very smart move on their part. Likewise, I think Secretary Mattis has been very active behind the scenes, trying to make sure that issues like your purchase of Sukhoi fighters doesn't become a distraction. We have a law in America that was passed recently called the CATSA Act, which is Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. And basically that would sanction countries that have very large defense purchases from Russia. And I think Secretary Mattis has been very good at trying to insulate Indonesia and India and a few other countries from that, and try to point out that the purpose of that legislation is not to punish friends like Indonesia and India. It's to stop Russia and, again, to penalize them for some of the policies they're taking in places like the Crimea and Syria and elsewhere. So that's been helpful. Now, all of that said, I think there are steps that Indonesia could take that would help to continue to manage effectively relations between the United States and Indonesia. First, I think it would be helpful for Indonesia to minimize economic nationalist actions that affect U.S. companies. As I said earlier, the Trump administration focuses very closely on what happens to American companies around the world, so they'll be watching what happens here as well. One example, the recent decision by Pertamina to take over the Rokan field, I think was a missed opportunity, frankly, because Chevron was prepared to invest probably billions of dollars into the Rokan field, which Pertamina and Indonesia will now have to find other financing for. But also, again, you know, I hate to see a big company like Chevron, which has been here in this country for a very, very long time, reduce its investment, reduce its interest in Indonesia. We'd like to see the opposite trend. We'd like to see more investment coming in. And I think you've seen that there was an article today in the Jakarta Post that the trade account, the current account deficit has increased because of increased oil and gas imports in the last month. And those are the results of policies like that. Second, while tax luxury imports to reduce its current account deficit and protect the rupiah from further depreciation, imposing new taxes on U.S. consumer goods is likely to undercut the goodwill that was generated by Minister Lukita's visit in July. So I just urge the Indonesian government to be very careful in how they implement those and be careful not to, again, undercut some of that goodwill that they've generated. Third, I think much of the U.S. business community, and certainly the administration, are watching very, very closely the Freeport negotiations. Everyone wants to see Indonesia and Freeport reach a mutually satisfactory agreement, in which, very, very importantly, Freeport retains management control. And I think, of course, this is in Indonesia's own interest, because Freeport is prepared to make billions of dollars in new investments in what is going to be the most complicated, technically, in terms of engineering and other things, mine in the world. And so naturally they want to be able to retain management control. Fourth, and finally, I think it's important for the government to continue to work very, very constructively with the U.S. Trade Representative, which is the most important trade organization. There are a lot of people in Washington who claim to be responsible for trade, but really it's the USTR. And so, again, thus far, I think there's been very good back and forth between the United States and Indonesia, and I just hope that that momentum will continue and that the sort of constructive mindset will continue. So let me just sum up my key points, and then I'll be glad to take your questions. First of all, Trump, as promised, and without apology, has pursued a disruptive foreign policy and a disruptive domestic policy to, again, respond to the demands of his base. Secondly, I'd like to just say that whatever you might think, our system of checks and balances is still working. And don't write off American democracy. So if you want, those of you who are journalists, if you want a headline, that's your headline. Don't write off American democracy, because the system of checks and balances is still working here. Third, although Trump's approval ratings among sort of average Americans have fallen quite substantially, his support among his base remains very strong. So again, Trump himself remains a political force to be reckoned with inside the country. Fourth, for that reason, the Republicans who now control the House of Representatives and the Senate have been reluctant to challenge Trump and exercise their oversight responsibilities. Fifth, if the Democrats take back the House, which seems increasingly likely, you will see them launch a whole range of oversight investigations and hearings and put much greater pressure on the administration than we've seen in the last 2 years. And finally, U.S.-Indonesian relations thus far have proceeded very well and have, again, been largely unscathed by all of the controversies and things that are happening in Washington. Thanks to the bipartisan support that does exist on both sides of the relationship. But I think, again, good diplomacy has to continue, and the Indonesian government needs to continue to act in good faith to address some of the legitimate concerns like reducing the trade deficit between the United States and Indonesia. So, I'm sorry I talked a little bit longer than I should have, but again, I want to thank FPCI and USINDO for this wonderful opportunity, and I'm glad to open the floor to questions on any of what I've just said or anything else you'd like to talk about. Thank you so much.